Montana Territory, 1883. The wind dragged snow across the high prairie as the eastbound stagecoach rolled into the town of Birch River, its wheels crunching through frost-hardened mud. Regina Mayfield pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, glancing through the cracked glass at the weathered buildings outside. She was 23, educated back east, and had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to become a wife. Her hands trembled in her lap, not from cold, but from the weight of hope and fear. The stagecoach came to a shuddering stop. She stepped down carefully, boots hitting the ground with purpose. Her trunk was lowered beside her, heavy with books and letters, not dresses. A man in a fine black coat approached. Thinning blonde hair, sharp gray eyes. "Pastor Whitmore. You Regina Mayfield?" "Yes, sir." "You'll come with me." She followed him down the main street, past men staring from boardwalks and women peeking from behind curtains. Her fiancé, Mr. Thomas Langley, was waiting near the church. He was a merchant, older, clean-shaven, and wore a look of irritation rather than welcome. "You're not what I expected," he said, arms crossed. "I wrote you many letters," Regina replied, standing tall despite her nerves. "I was clear about my education. You said you taught children. You did not say you read Latin. I studied languages. I also know arithmetic, astronomy, and I do not want a wife who thinks she knows more than a man." Regina felt the sting, but she did not shrink. "Then I am not your wife." It was over before it began. She stood at the edge of the boardwalk, watching him walk away, her trunk sitting beside her in silence. Pastor Whitmore sighed and motioned toward the church. "You can stay in the parsonage. One night, then you'll need to move on." Regina nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. By the next morning, word had spread. The mail-order bride with too much book learning. She walked through town with her head high, though whispers followed her like smoke. That afternoon, as she was leaving the mercantile with a loaf of bread and nothing else, a quiet voice spoke behind her. "I read Virgil once. Did not understand much of it." She turned. A tall man stood there, brown hair wind-tousled, coat dusty, a book tucked under his arm. His eyes were green, thoughtful, and kind. Maybe 30, maybe a little older. "I am Nolan Shepard," he said. "I have a homestead outside town, about 6 miles west." "Regina Mayfield," she replied warily. "You read Virgil?" "Just the parts translated," he said, his smile small but warm. "I liked the rhythm of it." There was a pause, long and strange, and not uncomfortable. "I raise sheep," he continued, "and 2 children. Their mother passed 3 winters ago." Something in his tone made her chest ache. "I see," she said softly. "I heard what happened with Langley," he said. "Foolish man." She tilted her head. "Why do you care?" "Because I need a wife," he said plainly. "Not just someone to cook or fold shirts. Someone to talk to. Someone to help raise my son and daughter. Someone who wants a good life, not just an easy one." Regina blinked. "You barely know me. I know you came all this way for a chance. And I know you stood your ground when he turned you away. That tells me enough to ask if you would come out to the homestead. Just to visit. Meet the children." She studied him. He did not beg. He did not flatter. He simply waited, calm and steady. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." The next morning, she rode beside him in his wagon, the wind biting but the silence between them comfortable. His land rolled out under wide sky rough fences, a small cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, sheep grazing in the distance. 2 children burst out the door when they arrived. The boy, about 8, had a sling of twine and a gap-toothed grin. "Papa!" The girl, smaller and watchful, clung to her brother's hand. "This is Samuel," Nolan said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "And this is Susanna." Regina crouched low. "Hello. I am Regina." Samuel eyed her curiously. "Do you know stories?" "I do. Quite a few." Susanna only nodded, eyes wide. Inside, the cabin was warm. There was a small shelf of books, a table built by hand, and quilts that had seen many winters. Nolan poured coffee. Regina sat, watching the children draw with charcoal on scrap paper. "They miss their mother," he said quietly, beside her. "But they need someone who will not vanish." "I do not vanish," she replied. He looked at her then, really looked, and nodded like he believed her. That evening, as the sun dropped low and the cabin filled with gold light, Samuel asked, "Are you going to be our new mama?" Nolan rose from his seat. "Samuel," Regina reached across the table, touching the boy's hand. "Would that be all right with you?" Samuel grinned. Susanna climbed into her lap without a word. Nolan stood by the fire, his face unreadable but his eyes soft. After the children were asleep, Regina stepped out onto the porch. Nolan followed, standing beside her under the stars. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I meant what I said. About needing someone strong. Someone who sees more than dirt and sheep." She turned toward him, her voice low. "And I meant what I said. I do not vanish." He took her hand, rough palm folding over hers. "I do not want a woman who makes herself small," he said. "I want you. Just as you are." Regina leaned into him, forehead against his shoulder. "I want you too," she whispered. Nolan's breath hitched. He kissed her temple gently, like a promise. Out on the porch, under the wide Montana sky, with snow still clinging to the earth and warmth blooming quietly between them, they stood together. And for the first time in a long time, Regina felt chosen for exactly who she was. Nolan stood early, as he always did, the sky still dim with dawn and the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. He slipped quietly from bed, careful not to wake Samuel or Susanna from where they lay curled together on their sleeping pallet near the hearth. Regina had taken the cot the night before, her trunk set neatly at its foot, her shawl folded with care over the back of the single chair. He stepped out to the yard, boots crunching frost. The sheep stirred in the pen, their breath steaming in the cold. He poured grain into the trough, then checked the fence line, his thoughts circling the woman now under his roof. Inside, Regina had risen by the time he returned. Her hair was braided back, sleeves rolled, hands dusted with flour as she pressed dough into a rough round. "I found cornmeal and lard in the tin," she said without looking up. "I hope you don't mind." He hung his coat and crossed to the basin to wash. "You didn't have to." "I know." She turned then, eyes steady. "I wanted to see if it still came out right." The bread was coarse and dense but warm, eaten with molasses and silence. Susanna leaned against Regina's side, thumb tucked in her mouth, while Samuel tested the crust with his teeth. After breakfast, Nolan hitched the wagon. "I'll cut timber today. We've got a corner of the barn coming loose." Regina wiped her hands on her skirt. "I'll teach the children their letters." He paused, one boot on the step. "You sure?" They never had much patience for sitting still. "I've taught worse." He nodded once, the corner of his mouth twitching just slightly. Then he was gone, wagon creaking down the trail toward the timber stand. By mid-morning, Regina had cleared the table and drawn a few shapes on a scrap of paper. Samuel sat cross-legged on the floor, frowning at the chalk in his hand. "What's the point of this one?" he asked, pointing to the looped G. "It's in goat," she said. "And good. You like both of those, don't you?" He snorted. "I like sheep better." Susanna traced her finger over the page slowly, lips moving without sound. Regina touched the girl's wrist gently. "You don't have to say it out loud," she whispered. "Just show me where you see this." The girl pointed, eyes darting to Regina's face. "Well done." Regina smiled, but didn't reach for her. She let the girl stay where she was, half behind the chair leg. By the time Nolan returned, his arms full of cedar planks, the cabin smelled faintly of boiled apple and soot. He set the wood down and dusted his hands. "How did it go?" "Samuel prefers livestock to letters," Regina said, glancing up from the table where she was mending a torn hem. "Susanna knows more than she lets on." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her thread the needle with care. "You look like you've lived here for years." "I've lived in many places," she said, tying off the thread. "All of them temporary. This one feels less so." He didn't answer right away. "Then there's a spring just beyond the ridge. Water's clean. I take the children there in summer." She folded the mended cloth. "When the ground softens, I'd like to see it." He stepped inside, took off his gloves. There's a shed out back. We could clear it. Make it into a schoolroom if you're set on teaching. I'm set on giving them more than chores and dust. Her voice was quiet, her hands still. Books saved me once. I'd like to offer that to someone else. He looked at her then, long enough for her to feel the weight of it. I've never known anyone like you, he said. I've always been someone like me, she replied, not smiling, not cold, just true. That night, after the children were asleep, Nolan sat on the porch again, sharpening his draw knife in steady strokes. Regina joined him, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hair let down for the first time. The ends curled slightly, catching the firelight from the oil lamp inside. I used to think if I knew enough, I'd be safe, she said. That cleverness could keep the world at bay. And now, I know better, but I still believe it helps. He set the knife aside. What would you have done if I hadn't spoken to you in town? She rested her hands in her lap. I would have gone on. Found work somewhere. Maybe taught school in Miles City. And now, I'm thinking of a shed that might become a classroom. And a man who might become a home. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of something waiting to bloom. He reached for her hand, not tentative, not bold, just sure. She let him have it. They sat like that until the moon rose above the ridge, pale and silent. The wind had died. The sheep slept. And inside, 2 children dreamed in warmth. The thaw came slow that spring, coaxed by a string of pale mornings and rains that softened the earth in steady rhythm. Regina stood at the edge of the field, watching Nolan and Samuel mend the fence post by post. Susanna crouched beside her, poking a stick into the damp soil. The girl had begun to hum to herself lately, soft tunes with no words, and Regina didn't interrupt. By mid-April, the shed had been cleared of rusted tools and mouse nests. Nolan had planed and fitted a new door, and Samuel had helped carry in a bench and a narrow table. Regina laid out the slates she'd brought in a wrapped cloth, each one smoothed and blackened for use. The children called it the schoolhouse, and the name stuck. One afternoon, after lessons, Regina lingered by the sheepfold while Nolan checked the west fence line alone. She watched Susanna gather wild onion with careful fingers while Samuel trailed behind, a stick slung over his shoulder like a rifle. Her apron was stained with dirt and lamb's milk, her hands cracked from soap and cold water, but her heart had begun to feel sturdy again. That evening, while the children trimmed candle wicks, Nolan brought in a parcel wrapped in butcher's paper. He set it by the hearth without a word. Regina unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a copy of Plutarch's Lives, its leather spine faded but intact. I found it in a barrel at the store, he said, settling onto the bench. Traded 2 pelts for it. Wasn't sure if you already had it. I haven't read this one since I was 16, she said, running a hand over the worn cover. We had to share the copy between 7 girls at school. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What did you think of it then? I thought it made men seem larger than life. Now I think maybe they were just tired most of the time. She looked up at him. Trying to do right, even when they didn't know how. He nodded, quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about the land to the east. There's a stretch along the creek that might take to potatoes. Regina folded the paper carefully, tucking it beneath the bench. You'll need help clearing it. I was hoping you'd say that. That night the wind changed. It brought the scent of wet bark and turned soil. Nolan stayed outside longer than usual, oiling the plow handles, and Regina stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him in the fading light. Do you regret it? She asked. He looked up. Regret what? Bringing me here? Letting me stay? He wiped his hands on a rag and straightened. No, I only regret not asking sooner. She stepped out to him, the porch creaking beneath her. You waited until I had nowhere else to go. I waited until I was sure I had something worth offering. She touched his arm, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. You do. The silence between them felt different now, no longer filled with questions, but with understanding. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of days changed with the season. Regina rose with the sun and helped Nolan hitch the mare. She led lessons at the table before noon, then worked beside him in the fields through the afternoon. Susanna began speaking in full sentences, quiet but clear, and Samuel took to reading aloud from the hymnal most evenings, stumbling only on the longer words. One Sunday, Nolan set a bundle of folded cloth on the table. I asked Mrs. Hargrave to help me choose something. Said I wanted to do this properly. Regina opened it slowly. Inside was a dress of dark blue muslin, simple but fine, with a row of carved buttons down the front. I don't have a ring, he said, but I can promise you a roof that doesn't leak and a name that's yours. She looked from the dress to him, her voice steady. I don't need a ring. I need what I found here. Nolan moved around the table and took her hands. You're the only woman I've met who carries her heart like a blade sharp and meant to cut through the world's foolishness. She pressed her forehead to his chest. And you're the only man who ever thought that blade belonged. They were married under the cottonwoods by the creek, with Samuel holding Nolan's coat and Susanna clutching a bouquet of wild yarrow. Pastor Whitmore arrived in his cart, dry and formal as ever, but he didn't hesitate when Nolan asked him to speak the words. Afterward, they ate bread and dried peaches by the fire. Nolan carved a small box for Regina's books and placed it beside their bed. She hung the dress on a nail near the window, where it caught the light each morning. The land never stopped demanding. Fences still broke. Storms still came, but the loneliness had gone. And when the nights grew long and the wind rattled the shutters, Regina would reach across the quilt and find Nolan's hand, solid and warm, and know that whatever lay ahead, they would face it as one. By early June, the creek had warmed enough for the children to wade in up to their knees, trousers soaked and laughter echoing off the cottonwoods. Regina knelt on the bank, sleeves rolled to her elbows, guiding Susanna's small hands through the careful art of washing wool without stripping its lanolin. The girl rarely asked questions aloud, but her eyes followed every motion, every squeeze and swirl, until her fingers mimicked the rhythm with quiet precision. Nolan stood a few paces off, holding a sharpened spade. That sheep of ours, the one with the black patch over her eye, she's taken to wandering farther than the rest. I figure she's nosing out a better graze. Regina skimmed her hand across the surface of the water, lifting a length of clean fleece onto the drying stones. Or she's got a mind of her own. Takes one to spot another. He crouched beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. I was thinking we might fence off a strip on the north side. Let it go to seed. Then turn it next year. You think in seasons, she said, eyes shading thoughtful. Back in New York, everything was measured in hours. Seems a hard way to live. It was, she said softly. They worked in tandem as the sun reached its highest point, while spread out in soft clumps across the flat stones, the children now busy with smooth pebbles and stories of imagined wolves in the brush. When they returned to the cabin, Regina slipped the kettle over the fire hook and began sorting dried herbs into a tin. What's that one? Nolan asked, nodding toward the pale green leaves. Yarrow. Helps with scrapes. And fevers if steeped long enough. You gather all this on your own? I did. Learned to identify them from a field guide in school. But it was the hills outside Albany that taught me which ones actually work. He reached for the tin but didn't touch it, just looked. I didn't know you practiced healing. I never called it that. She paused, measuring out a pinch. But I don't like waiting on a doctor from 3 towns over when something can be eased with what's already in hand. That evening, Nolan brought in a broken harness strap, laying it across the table. You ever work with leather? Only once. She examined the tear. A girl I boarded with had a brother in the cavalry. She showed me how to stitch a saddlebag. He handed her an awl and a length of heavy thread. I'd like to see how you'd fix this. She worked slowly, thumb pressed against the edge to keep the punch straight. He lit a second lamp as dusk crept in, watching her hands move with deliberate care. You're good with your fingers, he said quietly. No wasted motion. I had to be. A woman with no money and too many opinions needs to be useful in more than one way. Is that how you see yourself still? She tied off the thread, her eyes lifting to his. I see myself changing, not softening, but settling into something truer. He didn't speak, just reached across and touched the stitched leather, his hand brushing hers in the motion. His thumb rested there a moment longer than necessary. The days stretched longer after that. Regina began keeping a ledger of their stores, the pages marked with tidy lines and notes about which barrels had gone light, which shelves needed restocking. Nolan cleared the loft space so she could stack her books in a dry place, and she began copying passages from memory before bed, her pen scratching softly as the fire burned low. One night, after the children had fallen asleep with their arms twined around each other, Nolan found her on the porch, hair damp from washing, face turned toward the dark horizon. "I got a letter today," he said, sitting beside her. She turned. "From whom?" "My sister. Lives near Fort Benton. She's coming through with her husband in July, bringing seed potatoes and a new scythe." "Will she be staying long?" He hesitated. "2 nights, maybe 3. I told her you're here." Regina folded her hands in her lap, voice calm. "And what did you tell her about me?" "That you're my wife. That you teach the children. That you read books I've never heard of but treat every living thing like it matters." She turned toward him more fully now, moonlight catching the damp lashes of her eyes. "That's a fair summation." He reached for her hand, linking their fingers tightly. "I'm proud of what we're building here. I don't want to explain it, I want her to see it. She might not understand. She doesn't have to." They sat like that, palms pressed, the silence between them no longer tentative but full of quiet certainty. Inside, the cabin exhaled the warmth of the day, and out here, under a sky thick with stars, they were no longer 2 strangers hoping for something better. They were, at last, living it. The morning Nolan's sister arrived, the air was thick with the scent of pine pitch and sun-warmed dust. Regina stood at the wash basin, pressing the last of the children's Sunday clothes flat beneath her palms. The cabin had been swept, hearth scrubbed, and a fresh strip of curtain hung over the window. She didn't fuss. She prepared. Samuel sat on the step, boots swinging, his face flushed with anticipation. Susanna clutched a bit of twine between her fingers, winding and unwinding it in a slow loop. They didn't ask questions about who was coming. They trusted. The wagon creaked into view just before midday, pulled by a pair of broad-shouldered bays. A tall man climbed down first, shoulders wide as the barn door, then turned to help a woman in a traveling coat the color of dried clay. Her face was narrow, angular around the mouth, with dark eyes that flicked across the homestead in quick, assessing strokes. She stepped down without waiting for help and set her gloved hand on her hip. "Nolan. Lydia." He embraced her briefly. The man, her husband, tipped his hat toward Regina, who met his eyes with a polite nod. "This is Regina," Nolan said. "My wife." Lydia's gaze didn't falter. She walked forward and held out her hand. "You've got a firm jaw," she said. "Langley always did like the weak-chinned ones." Regina took the offered hand. "Grip even. I don't measure myself by what men like." "Good." That night they ate in the open, the table pulled outside beneath the cottonwoods, supper laid out on borrowed oilcloth. Lydia leaned back in her chair after the meal, sipping from a tin cup. "You've done well here," she said to Nolan. "Better than I thought you would." He didn't look at her. "I had help." Regina reached to gather the empty plates. Lydia stood first. "I'll do it," she said, stacking them with practiced ease. "I didn't come to be waited on." Inside, the children fell asleep on a borrowed pallet, curled against each other like kittens. Regina stood beside the hearth, drying her hands. Lydia handed her the last plate. "You look tired," Lydia said. "I sleep well enough. Still, this isn't a slow life." "No, but it's the first one that's ever felt like it belonged to me." Lydia studied her a moment. "I thought you'd be soft. The kind of woman who wears lace gloves to milk a cow." "I tried lace once," Regina said. "Didn't suit me." Lydia's mouth twitched. "I see why he chose you." The next morning, Regina walked the perimeter of the field with Nolan, checking the new shoots. The breeze carried the scent of growing things, and the earth had taken on that rich, black smell of midsummer promise. "She doesn't take kindly to strangers," Nolan said. "Never did." She's not a stranger now, Regina said. And she's not wrong to test what she sees. He stopped walking, took her hand. When I look at this land, I see what we've done together. When I look at you, I see what's still possible. She stepped close, her voice low. Then let's keep building it. Lydia and her husband left the following afternoon, wagon laden with seed and gratitude. Before she climbed aboard, Lydia pressed something into Regina's palm, a small, polished stone carved in the shape of a bird. For luck, she said. Not that you need it. Regina watched the wagon vanish across the ridge, the bird warm in her hand. That evening, Nolan found her by the stream, skirts tucked high, her feet in the water. She didn't turn when he sat beside her. I've been thinking, he said. You've given the children more than I ever could have. You gave them steadiness. She looked at him, water lapping at her ankles. And you gave them safety. And a place to grow. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. I never had much to offer, but I saved this for something good. Inside was a ring, plain silver, with a single etching around the band oak leaves, carefully carved. It's not store-bought, he said. I carved it in winter, when the wind kept us close to the fire. I thought maybe, when it felt like time. She took it from him, slid it onto her finger. It's time. He kissed her then, not rushed, not hesitant, just the kind of kiss shared between two people who knew they'd found the place they were meant to stay. The sky stretched wide above them, the sun dipping low behind the trees. The water moved slow and steady around their feet, and the world felt still. That fall, the potatoes came in clean and round, the sheep gave strong wool, and the children read aloud from the Psalms without stumbling. Regina opened the schoolhouse to two neighbor children who arrived each morning with slate boards and bright eyes. Nolan built her a second shelf for the books, and she filled it with stories she copied by hand, one by one. By winter's first frost, the cabin had doubled in warmth. Regina sat by the fire with Susanna curled at her side and Samuel reading aloud from a story she'd written herself. Nolan stood at the hearth, his hand resting against the wooden lintel, watching the people he loved and the life they'd made. They didn't speak of the past much anymore. It had its place, as all things do. But the future stretched long ahead of them, full of work and wonder in equal measure. Together, they built it one harvest, one lesson, one quiet evening at a time. And the love between them, born not of convenience but of choice, held through every season that followed.